I want to look at how sanctity, holiness for women was regarded before Clare's time, when Mary was taken as the model for women, and see how Clare continued that pattern but also broke away from it. So, did Clare of Assisi break the mould? The mould which I'm discussing with regard to Clare is this supposed pattern of holiness for women. So first of all, we have to ask, well, was there a mould or a pattern or a model for female saints into which holy women were expected to fit? And if there was, did Clare conform? My own current research is very clear that there definitely was an expected pattern for holy women. Mary was the exemplar which female saints were expected to replicate. We more or less take that for granted. But then there's another and perhaps a surprising question that we have to ask. Which Mary? And it's not the Mary that we find in the Gospel accounts. In Matthew and Luke, we find a poor Jewish peasant girl, first engaged, then married to the local carpenter in an insignificant village in Galilee, the north of Palestine, about whom we know nothing, except that she lived the life of an observant Jewish artisan's wife and was the mother of a family. But the pattern that women were supposed to follow is the Mary that we find in a little known but an often quoted apocryphal text from the 2nd century, the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi, the Gospel of James, which spread like wildfire throughout the then known Christian world, the early centuries, and has left its mark on the devotional lives of Christians ever since. And in this text, we find a very different Mary. A Mary who, far from being poor and insignificant, is the privileged and favoured child of a very wealthy, very highly regarded, very influential citizen of Jerusalem, named Joachim, who, according to this text, conceived this child with his aging wife, Anna, probably miraculously, in answer to their combined prayer, and who brought this child up in almost unimaginable isolation in order to preserve her purity, not even allowing her feet to touch the ground, lest she be defiled. And when she was 3 years old, she was taken, so the story goes, to the temple, where she was welcomed by the high priest, and not just into the temple, but into the very Holy of Holies itself, where she lived in even greater isolation. She was fed by angels until she was 12 years old. This is the Mary that religious women in the church were expected to imitate. Notwithstanding the fact that the details of the story couldn't possibly have been historically true, and the fact that the apocryphal Gospels had been condemned by the so-called Decretum Gelasianum, Jerome had called this particular text variously a fabrication of heretics, apocryphal nonsense, and idle dreams. He said that potential readers should steer clear of all the apocryphal books because many had bad things many bad things had been inserted into them. Nevertheless, notwithstanding Jerome's strictures, the pattern for holiness expected of women in imitation of Mary, as she's portrayed in this text, became the ideal for women generally and for religious women in particular. And it remained so right down to the present day. We see this in documents emanating from the Vatican with their unreal emphasis on virginity, as in the Proto-Evangelium, Mary's virginity had to be maintained and safeguarded at all times. On the importance of living enclosed, just as Mary had been enclosed, first in her own bedroom, which was set up as a sanctuary to protect her from defilement, and then in the temple. And on the submissive, meek, silent, and obedient young woman that she became. Peter Brown puts it like this: two great images of continuity emerged in the 4th century in connection with the piety of women. The first was the image of the childhood of Mary. It was derived from the earlier Proto-Evangelium Jacobi. This 2nd century narrative already presented Mary as a human creature totally enclosed in sacred space. It set the tone for all later descriptions of the consecrated woman. Dedicated to the temple at the age of 3, Mary grew up in total isolation from the profane world." Unquote. But it all depended on Mary's attitude of humble, submissive obedience, which those who approach her for favours right down through the ages have always been expected to imitate. Although Marina Warner spares the Franciscans the single-handed responsibility for what she calls the ideal of the gentle housewife, she emphasises their influence in spreading a submissive, humble, docile depiction of Mary. She says, "Franciscan writings, like the Meditations on the Life of Christ, attributed until recently to the Orders General, St. Bonaventure, but now ascribed to Giovanni de San Gimignano, focus on the sweetness of the Virgin's character, on her youthful loveliness, her gentleness, her meekness, the tenderness she shows to her child, the lullabies she sings as she rocks him in the cradle." Unquote. And it's in this context of Mary's docility and subservience, which others, and women especially, are expected to emulate, that Sandra Schneider's remarks, and I quote, "The only feminine model who has been invoked with real fervour and consistency in the male church has been Mary, the mother of Jesus. And thus invocation has been badly misused in many periods of church history to reinforce and sacralize the subordination and passivity of women." Unquote. So we can see that the attitude of admiration and emulation of Mary, to which the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi gave rise in the 2nd century, and also the enormous impetus to these attitudes of piety and devotion to which it has given rise ever since, have affected the lives of women in general, and in particular religious women through the centuries, right down to the most recent document emanating from Rome for enclosed women religious. the Apostolic Constitution Vultum Dei Quaerere, just 2 years ago, on women's contemplative life, which holds Mary up as an example, and I've several short quotes. In this, Mary most holy can serve as your example. Over the centuries, the Church has always looked to Mary as the Summa Contemplatrix. In Mary, we glimpse the mystical journey of the consecrated person, grounded in a humble wisdom that savours the mystery of the ultimate fulfilment. Following Mary's example, the contemplative is a person centred in God, and for whom God is the unum necessarium, in comparison with which all else is seen from a different perspective because seen through new eyes. That's the end of these quotes from Vultum Dei Quaerere. So we see Clare as she has been portrayed and preserved in the Church's hagiographical tradition as fitting into this mould perfectly. I'm going to pick out 3 particularly noteworthy aspects of this mould into which Clare has been seen as fitting in imitation of Mary: virginity, enclosure, and meek and humble submission. She was hailed during her canonization process only 2 years after her death as the footprint of the Mother of God, just as other women saints have also been recognized as imitating and replicating Mary. Bridget of Ireland, who lived round about 451 to 525, was called the Mary of the Gale. Bridget of Sweden, 1303 to 1373, was, even more amazingly, so identified with Mary that she even claimed to have replicated Mary's biological pregnancy, was actually physically examined by church authorities to ascertain the veracity of this supposed state. Surprisingly, they reported in the affirmative. So, first of all, virginity. Throughout the ancient world, a woman counted for very little, and her only positive value was to provide children, and preferably sons, for her husband. To guarantee the legitimate fatherhood of these sons, at a time when DNA testing was many centuries into the future, a woman, once she had attained marital status, had to be safely hidden away out of sight, so there was no possibility that her child might have been conceived by anyone other than her husband. The strict ideal to which all women were expected to conform was virginity before marriage and marital chastity once married. The same standards, of course, were not expected of her husband. In all this, Mary was the great exemplar, and because of the enormous significance the Protoevangelium gives to Mary's continued virginal state before, during, and after the birth of Jesus, devotion to Mary through the ages has borne the imprint of its origin in this text, while the text itself has been all but forgotten. Mary was the ultimate female role model in Christianity. She was a chaste, modest mother who spun and wove and remained a virgin her entire life. She was the woman all women were expected to emulate. This was emphatically true in the society of Clare's day, especially of women in her social status. But Clare, apparently, was not afraid to flaunt these social mores. By leaving her parental home in the middle of the night, going through the dark streets of Assisi, beyond the protecting city walls, out into the countryside, to meet a band of young men in a nearby wood, she totally destroyed her own reputation and besmirched the honour of her family in a way that's almost impossible for us to appreciate. If you think how often there are headlines in the newspapers, a teenage girl has run off with an older man and all the ports and the airports are on the lookout for them. Even in our society today, which is permissive beyond anything Clare could have imagined, that's still a very serious situation. But in her day, it was unthinkable. Perhaps the only parallel in today's society, which helps us to see how devastating this was for her family, is the honour killing of Muslim girls and women when they're believed to have betrayed their family reputation. The fact that during her canonization process, 2 years after her death, so many of the sisters emphasized that, quote, she remained a most pure virgin all during her life. You kind of think, well, she'd been, nearly 50 years in a convent, but they were still hammering this home. So it would seem to indicate that the gossiping tongues of Assisi were still busy destroying Clare's reputation. So even though there is no evidence at all that Clare ever risked physically violating the pearl of her virginity that Francis counselled her to dedicate to God, she certainly was prepared to risk her virginal reputation, her value in the all-important marriage market of her day, and the honour of her family, and all this in the most public way possible, knowing full well what the consequences would be. We like to think of this lovely romantic story. Clare dressed herself up and she ran away in the night and it's all so beautiful. It was not beautiful in her day, it was scandalous. Next, enclosure. As a corollary of the importance of virginity, enclosure was an accepted and ever more sharply defined characteristic of women's religious life. I repeat the quotation from Peter Brown, which I made earlier on. He demonstrates the influence that the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi has had on the lives of religious women. He says, this 2nd century narrative already presented Mary as a human creature totally enclosed in sacred space. It set the tone for all later depictions of the consecrated woman. Dedicated to the temple at the age of 3, Mary grew up in total isolation from the profane world. Unquote. So it's my argument that although it aroused the ire of church fathers such as Jerome, who condemned it as a fabrication of heretics, so popular, so influential has this text been in religious thought through the centuries, that although the origins of the specific details have largely disappeared from Christian thought and imagination, its ideology lingers on. Such classic monastic texts as the Historia Lausiaca of Palladius show that from the very earliest days, withdrawal from the world into solitude was regarded as being of the essence of the monastic life for women as well as for men. And although the ascetic women of the desert were nowhere required to live under lock and key, their way of life was quite strictly circumscribed. Joyce Salisbury, in discussing the lives of 4th and 5th century holy women, comments, "Women were told to seek holiness by staying inside their homes and not travelling at all. The principle of enclosure, which was in fact what the fathers were advocating, suggested that for women, sanctity was to be found within, both within bodies that were to remain closed sexually and within rooms that were closed to the world." Unquote. So that points up the interdependence of virginity and enclosure, which becomes more and more explicit in later Vatican legislation. This interpretation of monastic life mirrors the description of Mary's holiness as it's presented in the Proto-Evangelium. However, strict enclosure and the status of bride of Christ awaiting her bridegroom, to quote Marilyn Dunn, was becoming more and more the norm for nuns. It became obligatory for all religious women, with the decree Periculoso, published by Pope Boniface VIII in 1298. So although it's later than the time of Clare, the time that we're considering, the actual text is illuminating in that the confining and constricting attitudes towards nuns that had long existed in the Church solidified into universal ecclesiastical law by means of this decree. This is the relevant passage which I quote, "That no nun tacitly or expressly professed in religion shall henceforth have or be able to have power of going out of those monasteries for whatever reason or cause, unless perchance any be found manifestly suffering from a disease so great and of such a nature that she cannot without grave danger or scandal live together with others, and to no dishonest or even honest person shall entry or access be given by them, unless for a reasonable and manifest cause, and by a special license from the person to whom the granting of such a license pertains." Unquote. So from the time of the publication of Periculoso onwards, all nuns, whichever monastic rule they observed, wherever their monastery might be situated, were solemnly bound by this strict law of perpetual cloister, and under no circumstances, except those of imminent danger, were they to break this law, either by exiting from their monasteries or by allowing unauthorized persons to enter. Sounds a little bit like Tom Herbst was describing as your life with your brothers in the snow. Clare had lived the greater part of her religious life observing the rule given to her by Cardinal Ugolino, who had been charged with the task of bringing order into the many groups of religious women which were proliferating in the Church at that time and causing the authorities great anxiety. He endeavoured to enforce uniformity among these nuns, and his legislation on enclosure was particularly stringent. The rule of life which he gave to Clare to be observed illustrates well the attitude, I'm afraid, of male clerics to women religious. And again I quote, "Therefore it is proper and it is a duty that all these women who, after condemning and abandoning the vanity of the world, have resolved to embrace and hold to your order, should observe this law of life and discipline and remain enclosed the whole time of their life. After they have entered the enclosure of this order and have assumed the religious habit, they should never be granted any permission or faculty to leave this enclosure, unless perhaps some are transferred to another place to plant or build up this same order. Moreover, it is fitting that when they die, both ladies as well as servants who are professed, they should be buried within the enclosure." Unquote. So Ugolino saw the obligation to remain within the physical boundaries of the enclosure as strictly binding throughout the life of each professed nun and even in death. While he makes no specific reference to the child Mary living enclosed within the temple, the tone of this text echoes the ascetic theology of the Proto-Evangelium. So although she accepted the principle of enclosure, and indeed is frequently credited with introducing the concept of enclosure as an actual vow, it's questionable whether Clare herself wished her sisters to remain strictly enclosed. Jacques de Vitry's famous letter of 1216 praises the sorores minores, the lesser sisters, who, and I quote, lived in hospices and supported themselves by their own labours and nursed the lepers. But the interpretation of this text is controversial. Not all scholars agree that it referred to Clare and her sisters. But whether Jacques de Vitry is describing the early Poor Sisters or not, Clare had very definite ideas of her own. Her vision of contemplative life was sufficiently broad and flexible that she legislated for her sisters to leave the enclosure, I quote, "for a useful, reasonable, evident and approved purpose," like coming to a meeting like this, without specifying minutely what these occasions might be. Although Clare did encourage the imitation of Mary, this was less in a physical and more in a spiritual way. She seems to have had a broader, less restrictive view of how a life of prayer and contemplation was to be lived. Regis Armstrong comments in a footnote to his translation of the Form of Life of Clare, Clare's balance between flexibility and acceptance of the monastic enclosure is a complex problem. Strikes me that it would be much truer to say that the balance is a great and clear-sighted gift rather than a complex problem. For Clare, monastic enclosure seems to have been a filter to strain out unnecessary, useless or distracting material from the lives of the nuns, rather than a prison sentence to a life immured. So by reading the sources carefully, we see that in both the issues of virginity and enclosure, Clare was prepared to break the mould that had been imposed on religious women. And lastly, humble and submissive obedience. Although in her rule, Clare counselled obedience and respect towards all lawful church authority and to superiors within the order, she was anything but submissive and subservient to church authorities when she felt her own ideals were being compromised. There's some evidence that towards the end of her life, Clare fell out of favour with the authorities. In Thomas of Celano's first Life of Francis, commissioned by Gregory IX in 1228, he waxes enthusiastic about Clare and her acknowledged sanctity. He describes Clare thus, I quote, "Noble by lineage, but more noble by grace, chaste in body, most chaste in mind, young in mind, mature in spirit, steadfast in purpose, and most eager in her desire for divine love, endowed with wisdom and excelling in humility, bright in nature, more brilliant in life, most brilliant in character," unquote. But in his second life of Francis, she's hardly mentioned at all. Pope Gregory IX, on his flight from Rome in the wake of attack by the Emperor Frederick at Easter 1228, had stopped off in Assisi and he'd gone to speak with Clare. And he'd offered her land and possessions in order to ensure security for her and her sisters in their way of life. These she had been unwilling to accept in accordance with her total commitment to poverty. The Pope said that if she was worried about keeping her vow of poverty, he would absolve her from it. Clare is reported to have said, with strong feeling, "Absolve me from my sins, Holy Father, but not from following Jesus Christ." Not surprisingly, Gregory departed in anger, and his admiring attitude towards Clare was never quite the same. There's also the incident when the friars were forbidden to come and preach to the sisters. They're trying to regularize the relationship between the two branches of the order. So the friars were not allowed to go and preach to the sisters. Clare said, "Right, if we're being forbidden the word of God, we will dismiss the friars that go begging for us, and we won't have any food either." She virtually went on hunger strike. Clare was very clear in her own mind about her calling. In this, she rather differed from Francis, who seems to have agonized over his own vocation. So I think we can see that in these three examples, that of virginity, enclosure, and subservient obedience, Clare both remained faithful to the principles involved, but also broke the mould which had been formed in the 2nd century by the Gospel of James, which had become the measure by which religious women were expected to imitate Mary, as she's found in this apocryphal text. But if we acknowledge that Clare did, in some ways, break the mould, we also have to acknowledge that later hagiography has done its best to push her back into this mould. And it's only a careful reading of the early texts which will recover the genuine Clare. The Santa Chiara d'Ossol at Assisi was the first 13th century painting dedicated to a female monastic. Its depiction of Clare as an active and determined woman stands in marked contrast to the images of humble and submissive brides of Christ. I'd like to look in some detail at the d'Ossol and just see what we can learn from it about Clare. It's preserved in the Basilica of Santa Chiara. There should actually be some music accompanying this, but it doesn't seem to have come through. And it's the girl with the flaxen hair, which I thought was very appropriate. So if you could just imagine that as it's going. That, I think, illustrates what I'm saying about the attitude of families, noble families at that time, when the daughters had misbehaved. They dragged Agnes away and left her for dead. Fine, no problem. That's what you do to girls who do this kind of thing. That little picture at the top corner, that is Agnes making her vows into Clare's hands and Francis cutting her hair. That's the only miracle that is recorded on this this painting. This is what hagiography has turned Clare into. This is how she's remembered by people who either knew her or people who knew the person who knew people who knew her. I think it's significant that on the dossal, the Tavola, there's no mention of the miracle when she freed Assisi from the Saracens. You know how Clare appears on millions of holy pictures and statues holding the monstrance. She never did that. There were no such things as monstrances in Clare's day. We know from the sources that it was the chaplain who brought the Blessed Sacrament in the silver box. Clare was prostrate on the floor, praying for the safety of her sisters. So the picture that hagiography has imposed upon her, the picture of Clare as a wonder worker, is inaccurate. We have to return to the sources, read them carefully, in order to discover the real Clare. It seems she had no intention of founding another monastic order of nuns. She invariably referred to the women who lived in San Damiano as sorores, sisters, not moniales, which was and still is the classic Latin word for nuns. In contrast to the friars, where men were flocking to join, it was several months before Clare and Agnes had another companion in San Damiano. Life in the little monastery was anything but rosy. Famine stalked Umbria during these years, and the description of illnesses suffered by the sisters are compatible with malnourishment. Clare was credited in the canonization process with healing sisters by making the sign of the cross over them. But then we learn that at least one of them had been ill for 15 years before Clare worked this miracle. But through all the problems and difficulties which surrounded her, Clare seems to have maintained a quiet and serene confidence, so different from Francis' anxiety and soul-searching. At the end of her life, rather than the medieval fears of hell and devils, the words that the sisters heard from her dying lips were calm and trusting. Go forth in safety, my soul, for you have a good companion for the journey. Be praised, my Lord, for having created me. We have to remember that the medieval world was a foreign country, and they do things very differently there. Clare followed Francis' advice, and she did what was hers to do. She was very much part of her own world, but she reached out beyond it. And she counsels us to do the same. Thank you.